Hi, it's Katie here. Now today I want to share with you a free tutorial that I've created. We're going to be using tubular peyote stitch to make some end caps for a Kumihimo rope. In actual fact, it's how I finished off this necklace that I'm wearing, so you'll get a bit more detail in a moment. But before I show you the detail, I just wanted to explain something. I've created this in small stages, so I've got little pauses between each stage, and I'm hoping that's going to make life easier for you because the whole video is quite long, but you'll be able to pause at various points so you can bead along with me and just catch up with me as I'm working. At least that's hopefully the plan. So anyway, before we get into that, I'm going to take the necklace off now and let you see the end caps in more detail so you can see what you're making. But even if you don't want to make those, this is actually just a nice way to learn tubular peyote stitch, and you can use that for all sorts of projects. So give me a second and I'll be right back. Okay, so I've just taken off my necklace so you can see what it looks like all the way around. Now the bit that I'm going to be showing you today is this, how to create beaded end caps to finish off a Kumihimo rope. Now they're just a nice way of adding an individual touch to your work. You can also tailor them to match the design if you want, and as you'll see when we get to the end, there's lots of different things you can do with them. But before we get that far, I'm going to take you back in time and show you where this started out. You're going to be working in tubular peyote stitch, which I will be demonstrating for you, and you're just going to see how I got from a plain Kumihimo rope to adding the end caps to finish off my necklace with a really individual touch. So off we go. Okay, so you've just seen where we finished up. Now it's time for me to take you back in time to where we started out. So I've got my Kumihimo rope here, and onto that I've threaded a honeycomb beaded bead. Now I'll link to the pattern for the beaded bead down below in case you're interested in making that. But I mean, this could be a pendant, it could be anything, or it might just be a plain Kumihimo rope. What I've done is finish up the end by sealing it with glue. You've got my starting end this side, so you can see there's the loose bit that was hanging through initially when I began. And what I need to do to finish this project is add in some end caps. Now I was planning on just gluing on shop bought end caps, but unfortunately when I took out my glue I realised that last time I sealed it I obviously didn't wipe it down properly, so I've basically managed to super glue the lid of my glue onto the glue tube, and there's no chance of getting it off as far as I can work out. Now obviously the logical thing to do would be to buy a new tube of glue, but I'm not going to do that. Instead, I'm going to make some beaded end caps to go on this, and I thought since I'm doing that I might as well show you how that works. So let's just move the necklace out the way for a second and take a look at the materials we need for doing that. So I've got size 11 seed beads. These are Miyuki brand, the normal round beads, so not delicas or anything like that, although you could actually use delicas if you wanted to. And you probably only need about 1 gram, 2 grams, not very many really. I've decided to use blue to go with the Kumihimo rope, but I could have used black or white to match my pendant, or I could be using silver to go with the clasp that I'm using. So anyway, the clasp, I've just chosen a bulk clasp because I like using that. I mean, you can use any kind of clasp you want, so you want whatever clasp you're using. Now my rope isn't quite as long as I would like, so I'm going to extend it by using an extension chain on the clasp. So rather than just a ring on the other side for the bolt ring to slot into, I've got a length of chain, and I'll cut that off so I've got about 3-inch length to use. And I've also got a little ring here. A split ring or a closed ring is ideally what you would like, and I'll explain that later on. So this is about 7mm in size, but the size isn't really too important. It needs to be large enough to thread beads through and to thread your clasp onto, so not too small, but a larger size ring would also work. So that's all we're going to be using, and I'll pause and let you sort out your own supplies and then come back and show you how we start. Okay, we're going to be working in simple tubular peyote to make this end cap, so it's nothing too difficult. I want you to start by cutting at least 4 foot, that's about 120 centimetres of thread. And I'm going to show you a little trick that I use when I'm starting out my tubular peyote. I actually use a stop bead, which is more commonly used when we're working in flat peyote, but you're going to find out it's really helpful for a tubular start as well. So I'm going to just thread on the first of my beads, and I'm going to slide it along the threads, and I'm going to leave a tail thread of about 8 inches, 20 centimetres. So we're going to use that later to fasten the end cap on. I'm then going to just pass through that bead one more time so that it's just kind of anchored onto the thread. Now this is going to be bead number 1 in my circle, and I want to pick up more beads, ending up with an even number of beads. So we've got 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, and that's about as many as I can get comfortably on my needle. So I'll slide those up to bead number 1. Now we're trying to work out what size of circle we need to start with to make the right end cap for our rope. So just looking at this string of 16 beads, I'm thinking that might possibly be long enough. So what I'm going to do is just bring in my necklace and look at which end of it is fattest, and I think it's probably the end with the glue on. So I'm going to measure that little line of beads around. So if I'm joining the last bead onto the first bead, that looks like that's going to be a pretty good fit. Okay, so having established that I'm happy with the fit for now, let's start on this tube. Now the first step is to join that line into a circle. So I'm going to pass through all 16 beads again, starting from bead number 1. So that's the bead where you've got your tail thread attached. I managed to get through all of them at once, so as I pull that thread up, I've got a circle, and because we've had that stop bead on bead number 1, it means the circle is actually quite firm. If you were just stringing beads, you'd find there's a lot of movement. So anyway, this circle forms rows 1 and 2 from tubular peyote. You'll see why in a minute. We're going to start on row 3, and all we're doing is picking up one bead, skipping the next bead from the circle, and passing through the bead after that. Then, so you want to pull in tight so the new bead you've added is sitting on top of a bead from your circle. So again, we pick up one bead, miss out the next bead from the circle, and pass through the following bead. And same again, pick up one, skip a bead, pass through the next bead. Pick up one, skip a bead and pass through the next bead. Pick up one, skip a bead, pass through the next bead. And we're going to keep doing this all the way around the row, and because we started out with 16 beads, we're going to end up with 8 beads per row, because you're skipping half your beads in effect doing this. So I'm coming now to my final bead, bead number 8. So I've skipped my bead from the circle. I'm going to pass through the next bead, so that's the last bead in my circle, and then I'm going to step up by passing through the first bead that I added when I started this row. And see there we go. Okay, so at the end of row 3 we've still got a circle, but you can see the new row 3 beads are all sticking out. What we need to do is encourage this up into a tubular shape, and this really happens in row 4. So the technique remains the same, but I'm going to encourage you to try and cup your beads in your fingers, so you're encouraging the tube. We're picking up one bead. Effectively you're missing the next bead from the circle, but you're actually going through the next bead that's sticking up. So you may or may not be aware of missing out a bead. You may just be thinking about picking up a bead, going through an up bead, or you may be thinking about picking up a bead, leaving the bead underneath and going through the next up bead. It's really, up to you to sort of develop a thought that makes sense to you. Now again, this row has a total of 8 beads, so knowing that can be very helpful. If you're unsure, then count out 8 beads away from your main pile and work through those as you're working around the row. And aside from the way I'm holding it, which is helping to encourage it upwards, I'm also pulling my thread up tight after each stitch, so that also will help to pull the row 3 beads inwards. So with row 4 you're starting to get something that looks like a tube now. So that was bead number 7 going on. And you want to be aware, so when you're coming into bead 8, the last bead in your row, again you're jumping over that space, you're passing through the next bead, but it's not going to look like an up bead. If you can see, that next bead actually looks like it's sitting down, and then you've got an up bead sitting next to it. You actually want to go through both those beads, so that's the final bead from row 3 and the first bead from the row you've added, and that is your step up. And by doing that, that maintains an evenness all around the row, so you're always going to have 8 little beads sticking up. Now at the end of row 4 you just want to pause and check the fit of your tube again. So I'm just bringing in the end of my Kumihimo rope, and I'm just going to try sliding that tube over it, and yes, it's a good fit. It's quite snug, but it will definitely fit, so that's perfect. Now if your fit wasn't good, you would need to go back to the original string of beads, so that means taking out rows 3 and 4 of your peyote, undoing the circle, and then alter the number of beads in your original string. But just remember, you must end up with an even number, otherwise your tubular peyote wouldn't work. So if you needed to remove beads, you'd have to remove 2 beads or 4 beads or 6 beads. If you needed to add beads to make your circle bigger, you would need to add those in multiples of 2 as well. But happily this one's working out, so next we can just move on and carry on working in the tubular peyote. Okay, so you've already learned everything you need to know for tubular peyote. Each row is constructed exactly the same way as row 4. So you're picking up a bead, passing through the next up bead or the next but 1 bead, depending on how you're thinking about it, and you're going to work all the way around your circle. So remember how many beads you've got in your row. For me that's 8, and after the final bead you've got your step up. So you're just going to keep repeating that process, adding 1 row at a time, until your end cap or tube is long enough to fit over any of the section of ribbon or rope that you want to hide. So in mine you can see where the glue ends, so I want my end cap to be long enough to disguise that glue. Now I'm not going to keep on showing you the next rows. I'll get that finished off and then come back and show you what happens next. Okay, so I've finished enough rows to make my tube long enough to cover up the glued section on my rope. Now the next step is to pull the end of the tube inwards, so we're going to be decreasing in Peyote Stitch. All very simple. You're still going to pick up 1 bead, you're going to pass through the next up bead, just as you've been doing, and also the up bead after that. So that's passing through 2 beads. Pull up tight so that your 2 up beads are pulled inwards next to each other. So again, we pick up 1 bead and we pass through 2 up beads, and we pull everything in really tight so that those 2 beads we've passed through are pulled inwards. Bead number 3 going on the needle, and again we're passing through 2 up beads from the tube and pulling in tight. And again bead number 4 this time will be the last one. So you're passing through your obvious up bead, then you're passing through the last up bead from your previous row, and then you've still got your step up, so that goes through the first bead that you've added. And we pull all that in tight, and it's pulling inwards, so you've got 4 beads sitting up now instead of 8. So that's the first part of the decrease. Now in the next row we've got another straight row, so no decreases, nothing fancy. All you're doing is picking up one bead, locating the next up bead from the previous row. So remember, you're going to have a longer gap between these, and as you add in that new bead you want to pull in tight again. So that's bead number 1. Bead number 2, same process, goes through the next up bead from your decrease row, and again pull everything in really tight. Bead number 3 is the same, and bead number 4 is the trickiest to locate because again you've come to that step up. So you want to locate your up bead from the previous row, but then you're going to carry on through the first bead that you've added in this row. So that's your 4 beads, and everything's pulled up tight now. So just finish up by passing through all 4 of those beads again. You can take them one at a time or take them a couple at a time as I'm doing. And when you've done that, you've basically got your end cap ready to attach the clasp. Okay, so I'm going to attach my ring to the first end cap. To do that, I'm going to pick up 6 beads, 3, 4, 5 and 6, and also the ring. And I'm going to take my needle through the opposite bead from the final row. So if my thread's exiting bead number 1 in that final row, I'm going to go through bead number 3. If that sounds confusing to you, just take it through a bead that makes sense. So you're going to end up with that little loop of beads holding your ring or whichever part of your clasp in place. Now, to strengthen that, I would like to pass back up through all those 6 beads, back into the end cap, repeat that 3 or 4 times so it's secure, and then you can finish off your thread. And that completes the first half of your end cap. Now with my clasp setup, I also just need to add the actual clasp onto the ring. So I'm using round nose pliers, and I am going to try and open up the ring on my clasp. I do that by sliding it sideways, never pull it open because you'll never get it back in place again. I want to just slide that onto the ring, and then because I opened it sideways, I can now close it sideways back to where it started, and that gives me the clasp on one half of the end cap. Now if I just pop over here, I have got another end cap that I've made. It's exactly identical to the first one, and it has the chain on the end of this one. Now my rope did have quite similar finishes on both ends, but if you find one end of your rope is a lot thicker than the other, you can of course alter the size of the end cap to fit. But basically you're going to follow exactly the same procedure to make your second end cap. And now with those two ready, still with their tail threads attached I might add, we're ready to look at the final procedure, which is attaching them onto the rope. Okay, this last part is also very simple. So I've threaded my needle onto my tail thread, and I've also, remember how the tail thread was acting as a stopper, so you had it threaded through that bead twice. Well, you want to just undo that because otherwise you'll have a little bit of visible thread around the bead. And if you can't see the thread, then don't worry about it. But that's got your end prepared. Now I'm going to take my rope, slide it in to the end all the way, and then we're simply going to stitch from a bead in the end cap into the rope. So depending on what material you've used, it may be quite tricky getting your needle through, so just be careful and be patient with this. But you're basically, I mean, like if you know Peyote Stitch and you're familiar with zipping up, this is a bit like zipping up the end cap to the rope. So we're just going to go back and forth between an area of the rope and the next down bead on the end cap, and we're going to do that all the way around. And you can probably see my end cap beads are sort of pulling in, so they're creating a nice snug fit to the rope. Now when I've got all the way around there and I'm happy that the finish is secure, what I will end up doing is weaving back up through the end cap and finishing off my beading threads in the peyote tube section, because that's going to be easier to do and a bit more secure than trying to weave it into the rope. But having said that, if you want to weave into the rope, you can. So when I've got this end cap on, I'll obviously do the same with the other, and that will take us nicely back to where we started. Now, if you like that idea, it's something I've used on a few other Kumihimo projects. So in this wraparound bracelet, I actually used mini duo beads to create an end cap. Again, I was still basically working in a tubular, it was more like a herringbone with the mini duos. This time, instead of using a shop bought clasp, I attached a beaded clasp. So there's really loads of ways that you can adapt this. Now you've got the idea of the technique. You can try with different sizes of bead, different shapes of bead, different finishes, different clasps, and it just puts a bit of an individual touch onto your work. So hopefully that's inspired you to try something a little different with your Kumihimo. And all I want to finish by saying is thank you very much for watching, and if you enjoyed that, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, and I'll have a few more videos that will help you think in new ways and take your beading in different directions. Thanks and happy beading!